The moment the glass doors slid shut in her face, the entire lobby seemed to fall silent, like the world itself had paused to watch dignity crumble. A woman in a wheelchair sat frozen at the entrance of the Grand Hotel, her hands trembling slightly against the polished rims of her chair. The afternoon sunlight poured in through the tall windows, illuminating her in a way that made her look both fragile and unbreakable at the same time. Guests walked past, some pretending not to notice, others stealing glances before looking away. But no one stepped forward. Until he did. Before we go any further, if you believe in kindness, in second chances, and in standing up for what's right even when it's hard, take a moment to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Echoes of Stories. Your support keeps stories like this alive. Arman Haleem had never planned to be a hero. He was just a single father trying to make it through each day without falling apart. At 34, life had already taken more from him than he thought he could bear. His wife had passed away 3 years earlier, leaving him to raise his 6-year-old daughter, Meher, on his own. Every morning was a race against time, packing lunches, tying shoelaces, catching buses, and balancing a job that barely paid enough to keep the lights on. That afternoon, Arman had brought Meher along with him after picking her up early from school. She sat beside him in the lobby, swinging her legs gently, her small fingers clutching a half-melted ice cream cone. They were there for a simple reason, to attend a job interview. The hotel, one of the most prestigious in the city, was hiring maintenance staff, and Arman had scraped together enough confidence to apply. He had spent the morning rehearsing answers in his head, telling himself that maybe this could be the turning point. Maybe this job could give him and Meher a more stable life. But now, all of that faded into the background as his eyes locked onto the scene unfolding at the entrance. The woman in the wheelchair hadn't moved. A uniformed manager stood nearby, his expression cold and dismissive. Though no words could be heard clearly from where Arman sat, the body language told the entire story. The manager's crossed arms, the security guard's hesitant stance, and the woman's quiet stillness, it was a denial, a rejection, something deeply wrong. Arman felt something tighten in his chest. He tried to look away. He really did. Life had taught him to mind his own business, to survive by staying invisible. But Meher's voice, soft and innocent, broke through his hesitation. She asked why no one was helping the lady outside, and why she looked so sad. That was all it took. Arman stood up. Each step toward the entrance felt heavier than the last, as if he were walking against years of fear and self-preservation. He wasn't a man used to confrontation. But there are moments when silence feels like betrayal, and this was one of them. When he reached the doors, the afternoon heat brushed against his face, but it was nothing compared to the tension hanging in the air. The manager turned slightly, clearly annoyed by the interruption. Arman didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. There was a quiet firmness in his presence, the kind that comes from someone who has endured more than they ever wanted to. He questioned the situation, not aggressively, but with a calm insistence that demanded an answer. The manager responded with a rehearsed explanation about policy and reservations, something about the woman not meeting certain requirements. It sounded hollow, even to him. The woman in the wheelchair finally looked up. Her eyes met Arman's, and for a brief moment, everything else faded away. There was exhaustion in her gaze, but also something else, strength, resilience, and a quiet dignity that refused to be broken. Arman didn't know her story. He didn't know her name. But he knew one thing, this was wrong. He insisted that she be allowed inside. Not as a demand, but as a simple statement of what should be obvious. His words weren't loud, but they carried weight. Other guests began to notice now. Whispers spread. The manager's confidence wavered. Meher had followed him, standing just behind his leg, her small hand gripping his shirt. She looked up at the woman with a kind of pure concern that only children possess. It was that look, perhaps more than anything else, that shifted the atmosphere. Reluctantly, the manager signaled for the doors to be opened again. The woman was allowed inside. But the story didn't end there. As she was wheeled into the lobby, something subtle changed. Staff members who had previously ignored her now seemed uneasy. The manager's composure cracked slightly, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. Arman stepped back, ready to return to his seat, believing his part was done. But the woman stopped. She turned her wheelchair slightly and looked at him again. There was gratitude in her expression, but also something deeper, an understanding that this moment was bigger than it seemed. Time passed differently after that. Minutes later, a quiet ripple moved through the hotel staff. Phones were checked, whispers intensified, and suddenly, the same manager who had refused her entry stood rigid, his face pale. Because the truth had surfaced. The woman in the wheelchair was not just another guest. She was the owner of the hotel. Her name was Saira Vance, a name spoken in business circles with respect and admiration. A woman who had built an empire from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that most people couldn't even imagine. A woman who had spent years ensuring that her establishment stood for excellence, inclusivity, and humanity. And yet, in her own hotel, she had been turned away. The realization hit like a wave. Staff members scrambled to correct their mistake, their earlier arrogance replaced with forced politeness. But it was too late. The damage had already been done. Saira didn't raise her voice. She didn't create a scene. Instead, she simply observed, her expression calm but resolute. There was disappointment in her eyes, but not surprise, as if she had seen this kind of behavior before, in different forms, across different places. Then, she asked for Arman. He hesitated when called forward, unsure of what to expect. He hadn't acted for recognition. He hadn't even known who she was. He had simply done what felt right. When he stood before her, the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath. Saira studied him for a moment, as if trying to understand the kind of person who would step forward when everyone else stepped back. In his worn clothes, his tired eyes, and his quiet strength, she saw something rare. She saw integrity. And then, something unexpected happened. Instead of thanking him with grand gestures or empty words, she made a decision. One that would change everything. Days later, Arman received a call. Not for the maintenance job he had applied for, but for something entirely different. Saira had personally requested to meet him again. This time, not as a stranger in a lobby, but as someone who had recognized his character. The meeting took place in her office, high above the city. Sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the room. It was a stark contrast to the life Arman was used to, but he carried himself with the same quiet dignity. Saira spoke not just about what had happened, but about what it revealed. About the kind of people she wanted representing her company. About the importance of empathy, courage, and doing the right thing even when it's inconvenient. And then she offered him a position. Not just a job, but a role in guest relations, a position that required exactly the qualities he had demonstrated that day. Arman was stunned. He had spent years struggling just to survive, never imagining that a single act of kindness could open such a door. But this wasn't luck. It was a reflection of who he was. Life began to change slowly after that. The stability he had longed for finally became real. Meher's laughter filled their small home more often. There was still hardship, still challenges, but there was also hope, a steady, growing hope that things could get better. And Saira? She made changes too. Policies were revised. Staff were retrained. The hotel became a place where no one would ever feel invisible again. Because she had experienced, firsthand, what it felt like to be dismissed. All because one man chose to stand up. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you that even the smallest act of courage can change someone's world, take a moment to like, share, and engage with this video. Your support helps spread these powerful messages further than you can imagine. And before we end, here's something special. Comment below the word kindness if you believe that doing the right thing, even when no one is watching, still matters. Because it does. Arman never set out to change the world that day. He just refused to let it stay the same. And sometimes, that's more than enough.